as we begin to explore the difficult but essential question of why God sometimes delays answering our prayers, let's first acknowledge the reality that prayer is one of the most personal and intimate aspects of our relationship with God. When we come before Him, we do so with hopes, desires, and deep longings for change, healing, or intervention in our lives. It's a sacred moment where we pour out our hearts to the Creator of the universe, trusting that He hears us and cares for us. And yet, despite our heartfelt prayers, there are times when it seems that God remains silent, when our prayers seem to go unanswered, and the waiting stretches on. This silence can be unsettling. It's in these moments of delay that doubts may creep in. Does God hear me? Is He even listening? Why won't He answer? These are real struggles that many of us face in our walk with God. We may have prayed for months or even years for something, a job, healing, a wayward loved one to return to faith, or relief from a difficult circumstance. And yet it feels like God is silent. We may find ourselves asking, why does God delay answering prayers? Is He indifferent to our struggles? Does He lack the power to act on our behalf, or is there something deeper happening that we need to understand? Let me remind you, right from the start, that the very fact we are praying shows us something profound. God is at work in our lives, even when it doesn't seem like it. Prayer is never wasted time. Prayer is not just a one-way conversation where we ask for what we want, but a relationship in which we express our trust in God's ability, His sovereignty, and His perfect timing. The delay in answers to our prayers is not a sign of God's neglect, but rather an invitation to trust more deeply in His wisdom and timing. One of the first truths we must understand is that God's ways are not our ways, and His thoughts are not our ways, and His thoughts are not our thoughts. Isaiah 55:8-9 tells us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts, than your thoughts." From our limited human perspective, we may think we know what is best, but God, in His infinite wisdom, sees the bigger picture, the eternal picture that we cannot fully grasp. What may seem like a delay in answering our prayers is often God's way of working in ways that are far greater than we could imagine. The challenge for us as believers is to trust that God knows exactly what He is doing. Even when we don't understand the delay, we must rest in the assurance that God is never late, never negligent, and never indifferent to our needs. In fact, Psalm 27:14 encourages us with these words. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. Waiting is a part of the process, and it is in the waiting that our faith is deepened, our dependence on God is refined, and our trust in His goodness is solidified. We live in a fast-paced world where we are used to instant results, fast food, instant messaging, and quick answers at the touch of a button. But God's timing is often not like that. His timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match our timetable. God doesn't operate on our clock, but He operates in His perfect time, which is always for our good and His glory. I know that waiting can feel excruciating. When we are desperate for an answer, when we are enduring pain, or when we are longing for change, it is hard to understand why God doesn't answer right away. But this is where the challenge of faith comes in. Faith means trusting in God, even when we don't understand the delay. It means believing that God is not distant, that He is not unaware of our needs, but that He is carefully orchestrating all things according to His will. Just because we don't see the answer immediately does not mean that God isn't answering. He may be working behind the scenes, preparing something far better than we could ever imagine, or He may be using the delay to refine us, teach us patience, or strengthen our faith. Think of the example of the Apostle Paul. In 2 Corinthians 12:7-9, Paul writes about a thorn in the flesh, a persistent problem he prayed about repeatedly. He begged God to remove this burden, but God's response was not what Paul expected. God did not immediately take away the thorn. Instead, He said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul learned in that moment that God's grace was sufficient, and that God's strength is most clearly seen when we are weak. God delayed the answer to Paul's prayer, not because He didn't love him, but because the delay was necessary to teach Paul a deeper dependence on God. Paul's prayer was answered, but not in the way he had imagined. Instead of the removal of the thorn, Paul received a deeper revelation of God's grace and strength. And it was through that experience that he came to understand the sufficiency of God's grace in every situation, every situation. Similarly, we must learn to trust that God's delays are not denials, and that they serve a purpose. They teach us to lean not on our own understanding, but to trust God with the timing, with the outcome, and with our very lives. So, if you're waiting on God today, if it feels like your prayers are going unanswered, I want to encourage you to hold fast to the truth that God is at work in your life. He has not forgotten you. He hears your prayers, and He knows the deepest longings of your heart. His silence is not a sign of His absence, but a call to deeper trust, a trust that He will answer when the time is right. God's delays are not denials. They are divine invitations to trust Him more, to grow in faith, and to rest in His perfect plan. Our job in the waiting is not to give up or become discouraged, but to trust that God's timing is always for our good. And in the process, we will come to know the depths of His love, His grace, and His perfect will for our lives. In our walk with God, one of the most profound and challenging aspects is understanding that God's timing is always perfect, even when it feels like He is silent or delaying His answer to our prayers. We all know what it's like to pray with a sense of urgency, to call out to God in our deepest moments of need, whether it be for healing, for provision, for wisdom, or for the restoration of relationships. We have our timetables, our expectations, and our plans. And when God's response doesn't seem to align with them, we begin to wonder, why the delay? Why does God sometimes wait to answer our prayers, especially when the need feels so pressing? The truth is, God's timing is never accidental, and it is never without purpose. His delays are often His way of orchestrating something far greater than we could ever ask or imagine. God, in His infinite wisdom, sees the whole picture, while we, in our limited understanding, see only a fragment of it. We may think we know what is best, but God knows what is best for us, both in the present and in the future. His delay in answering our prayers is not an indication of neglect, but rather an invitation to trust in His perfect wisdom and timing. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. This is the heart of the matter. When God delays, He is calling us to trust Him more deeply, to submit to His will, and to recognize that His ways are far higher than ours. The very fact that He is silent or seemingly distant in our prayers does not mean He is not working. It may be that He is working behind the scenes in ways we cannot yet comprehend. Think about the story of the Israelites, for instance. In Exodus, we read about how the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt for over 400 years. For generations, they cried out to God for deliverance. They prayed and pleaded with God to set them free, and yet for centuries, it seemed as if He had turned a deaf ear to their cries. Imagine how they must have felt during that long, painful wait, wondering if God had forgotten them, wondering if God had forgotten them, wondering why their prayer seemed unanswered. But in Exodus 2:24-25, we are told God heard their groaning, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. The truth is, God had never forgotten His people. He had not been inactive. For over 400 years, He had been at work preparing the perfect moment for their deliverance. His timing was deliberate, and when the time was right, God acted in a way that displayed His power and glory in a way the Israelites could never have imagined. If God had acted sooner, they would not have witnessed the grandeur of His miraculous deliverance through the parting of the Red Sea, nor would they have fully understood His sovereignty over all the earth. The delay was not because God was distant, but because He was preparing the perfect time for His plan to unfold. His delay was for their good, even though they could not see it at the time. Similarly, there are times in our own lives when we feel like God is silent. We may pray and pray and pray, and yet the answer seems to be delayed. But in those moments, we must remember that God is at work even when we cannot see it. His delays often come because He is preparing us for something greater. Maybe He is refining our character, building our patience, or teaching us to trust in His timing. His delays are not a sign of His absence, but of His perfect wisdom. Psalm 27:14 encourages us with these words, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." Waiting is not always easy. It can be uncomfortable, it can be frustrating, and it can test our faith. But in the waiting, God is doing something in us that is preparing us for the answer we are so desperately seeking. He is strengthening our hearts and building our dependence on Him. Consider also the story of Joseph, whose life is a powerful testament to the importance of God's timing. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime he did not commit and imprisoned for years. For many years, he prayed and waited for God to deliver him, to fulfill the dreams He had given him as a young man. But God's answer seemed delayed, and Joseph's circumstances grew more difficult. Yet in Genesis 50:20, after all the hardships, Joseph finally saw the bigger picture. He said to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." God's delay in answering Joseph's prayers was not a denial of His faithfulness. It was part of His greater plan. The delay was necessary for Joseph to be positioned in a place where he could save not only his family, but an entire nation from famine. What Joseph could not see in the midst of his trials, he understood later that God was working behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for a far greater purpose than he could have imagined. In our own lives, God's delay often means He is positioning us for something greater. We may not understand the purpose of our waiting, but just as God used Joseph's years of hardship to prepare him for a significant role, God is preparing us for something incredible in His timing. The Apostle Paul reminds us in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Even in the moments when we don't see immediate answers to our prayers, we can trust that God is working all things for our good, even when we can't fully understand it. God's delay is also a test of our faith. It's easy to trust God when everything is going well, but it takes deeper faith to trust Him when things aren't going as we expected. James 1:3. For tells us, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Not lacking anything. God uses times of waiting to build our character, strengthen our perseverance, and refine our trust in Him. It's in the waiting that our faith grows. It's in the delay that we learn to lean into God more, to depend on Him more, and to trust Him more deeply. As we wait for answers, we become more mature, more grounded in His love, and more dependent on His perfect plan. So while we may not always understand why God delays answering our prayers, we can rest in the assurance that His timing is always right. His delays are never without purpose. In fact, they often hold the key to a greater revelation of His love, power, and faithfulness. Our role then is to trust in His perfect timing, knowing that He is at work behind the scenes, preparing us for the answers we seek and for the purposes He has set for our lives. As we wait, we grow. And when the answer comes, we will see that it was worth the wait, because it will be the perfect answer given in God's perfect timing. As we continue to reflect on why God sometimes delays answering our prayers, it's crucial for us to understand that often these delays are not just about waiting for something we desire, but about growing in our faith. God's delay in answering prayer is frequently a test of our trust in Him. Think about it. How many times have we prayed fervently for something only to feel as though God is silent or distant? We may wonder, why is He not answering? But here's the beautiful truth. God is using that waiting period to refine us, to build our faith, and to prepare us for the answer that's coming. We see this pattern all throughout Scripture. Abraham, for example, was promised by God that he would be the father of many nations, but he had to wait years before he saw the fulfillment of that promise. He waited for decades before Isaac was born. And yet, in that time of waiting, Abraham's faith was tested. His trust in God was stretched, and he grew stronger in his dependence on God's promises. When God finally answered, it wasn't just the birth of a child. It was a testimony to God's faithfulness and the fulfillment of His plan. God was preparing Abraham for a much greater purpose, one that would impact generations to come. But Abraham had to learn to trust God through the delays. He had to wait for God's timing, and in doing so, he learned that God's timing is never early or late. It is always perfect. Similarly, in our own lives, God sometimes allows us to experience delays in prayer so that we can strengthen our faith. These delays are not a sign of God's indifference or lack of power. Rather, they are a sign of His wisdom and His love. Think about the story of Job. Job lost everything: his wealth, his health, his family, yet he did not curse God. In the middle of his grief, Job wrestled with God, but he never let go of his faith. He trusted that God was sovereign, even when it felt as though God had abandoned him. And while God did not immediately answer Job's questions or remove his suffering, in the end, Job received not just an answer, but a deeper understanding of who God is. Through the delay in answering Job's prayers, God gave Job a new revelation of his glory, his power, and his goodness. The delay, though painful, was purposeful. Job's faith was tested, and when he came through the trial, he was a more faithful and steadfast servant of God than he had been before. When we face delays in prayer, we are often in a similar position. God isn't punishing us, and He's not ignoring us. Instead, He is inviting us to lean into Him more fully, to trust Him more deeply, and to wait with the assurance that His plan is unfolding, even if we can't see it yet. In fact, delays in prayer are often opportunities to grow in our relationship with God. If God gave us everything we asked for as soon as we asked for it, we would never develop the character traits that God wants to build in us. Patience, perseverance, and trust are qualities that are only developed through waiting. James 1:3-4 tells us, "Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." It's through the testing of our faith that God matures us, shapes us, and prepares us for the greater blessings He has in store. If God were to answer all our prayers immediately, we would miss out on the depth of relationship with Him that is cultivated in the waiting. We would fail to grow in the areas of trust, patience, and reliance on Him. The delay, though difficult, is a part of God's refining process, a process that makes us more like Christ. Furthermore, in the midst of waiting, we often experience God's presence in ways we never would if He answered our prayers instantly. There's something deeply intimate about waiting on God, about trusting Him even when we don't understand His timing. When we are forced to wait, we are invited to enter into a deeper fellowship with God, where we learn to hear His voice more clearly, to experience His peace in the midst of uncertainty, and to rely on His wisdom rather than our own. The delays in our prayers can bring us to a place of deeper intimacy with God than the quick answers ever could. It's in the waiting that we often find God's presence more fully, and we realize that His peace is not just in the answer, but in the process of trusting Him while we wait. The truth is, when God delays answering our prayers, He is not withholding something good from us. Instead, He is preparing us for something greater, something far better than we could imagine. His delays are not denials. They are divine appointments. They are opportunities to grow in faith, to deepen our dependence on Him, and to experience His presence in ways that we might not have otherwise. God's timing is always perfect, and His delays always serve a purpose. It's in these delays that we learn to trust Him, to rest in His goodness, and to know that He is always working on our behalf, even when we don't see it. And as we wait, we must remember that our faith is being strengthened, our character is being refined, and we are being prepared for the answer that is coming. The delay is not the end. It is just the beginning of a greater work that God is doing in our hearts. So when you face delays in your prayers, don't be discouraged. Don't doubt God's goodness or His love for you. Instead, take it as an invitation to trust Him more, to lean into Him more fully, and to remember that God's delays are often preparing us for blessings that are far beyond anything we could have imagined. In the end, God will answer our prayers, and when He does, it will be in His perfect timing and for His perfect purpose. And we will look back and see that every moment of waiting was worth it, because through it all, God was at work, shaping us, molding us, and preparing us for the answers that will glorify Him and fulfill His good plans for our lives. As we reflect on God's delay in answering our prayers, we must also understand that these delays often arise because God is working within us in ways that go beyond what we can see or comprehend. It's so easy for us to focus on the immediate need, the longing, the pain, or the uncertainty that we are facing, and think that God is simply not answering. But the reality is, God's delays are often part of His greater plan to prepare us for something bigger, something more profound than we can imagine. God sees the bigger picture, the one we can't see from our limited human perspective. He understands the intricate details of our lives, the needs of our hearts, and the timing that will truly bring the greatest good. When we pray for a solution, we may have a specific outcome in mind. But God's answer, though it may seem delayed, is preparing us for His greater will. When God delays, He is not ignoring us. He is perfecting His plan. Consider the story of Joseph, one of the most poignant examples of God's timing. Joseph's journey was one of suffering and delay. Sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and imprisoned for years, Joseph prayed for deliverance. He must have wondered why God allowed him to endure such pain and hardship. But as we know, God was not idle in Joseph's life. He was shaping Joseph's character, testing his integrity, and preparing him for the high position that would ultimately save his family and the nation of Egypt from famine. God delayed answering Joseph's prayer for deliverance because He was at work in Joseph's heart and in Joseph's future. In the end, when Joseph's brothers came to him and he revealed his identity, he said in Genesis 50:20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's life, marked by delays, was in fact part of God's master plan to bring about something greater, saving nations, including the very ones who had hurt him. What Joseph could not understand in the moment of his suffering, he understood in hindsight. God had been orchestrating every delay, every hardship, every step for a purpose beyond his comprehension. And in the same way, God's delays in our lives are not punishments, but opportunities for God to work in us and through us for a purpose that far exceeds our understanding. We also see the same theme echoed in the life of Jesus. When Lazarus, a dear friend of Jesus, became ill and died, Jesus delayed His response. In John 11:6 we read, "So when He heard that Lazarus was sick, He stayed where he was 2 more days." Imagine the confusion and pain that Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, must have felt. They had sent for Jesus, knowing that He had the power to heal, but instead He chose to delay. In fact, Lazarus died before Jesus arrived. It seemed like the perfect time for Jesus to act had passed. Yet when Jesus finally arrived, He said to Martha in verse 25-26, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Jesus knew the outcome before it even happened. He was not delayed out of indifference, but because He had a purpose. He was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, demonstrating His divine power and revealing His identity as the Son of God in a way that would solidify the faith of His followers and bring glory to His Father. In His delay, Jesus displayed the greatness of God's glory in a way that would not have been possible had He arrived earlier. And so it is with us. God delays in answering our prayers. It is often because He is preparing us for something greater, something that will bring glory to Him and build our faith in ways we can't yet see. Sometimes God delays answering our prayers because He is refining our desires. We come to God with our requests, and many of those requests are genuine, heartfelt, and good. But God knows that not everything we ask for is truly what is best for us. Sometimes our desires are misplaced, or our prayers are shaped by our own limited understanding. God delays in answering, not to punish us, but to refine our desires, to align them with His will. In the waiting, God is purifying our hearts, teaching us to seek His kingdom above all else. Psalm 37:4 tells us, "Take delight in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." When we truly delight in the Lord, when our hearts are aligned with His, we will begin to desire the things He desires, and we will find that our prayers shift from our own limited wants to His broader, perfect will for our lives. The delay is not about withholding something good from us. It is about preparing our hearts to receive what God knows is best, even if it is different from what we initially thought we wanted. Moreover, God's delays are opportunities for deeper dependence on Him. If God answered our prayers immediately every time we asked, we would be prone to rely on our own strength, our own wisdom, and our own timing. But God desires that we depend on Him for everything. He wants us to trust Him, not just in the moments when everything is going smoothly, but especially when we are in the waiting. The delay in answering our prayers teaches us to lean into God more fully, to acknowledge our need for His guidance, and to surrender our will to His. It is in the delay that we discover a deeper intimacy with our Creator. We learn to seek His face more earnestly, to cry out to Him more fervently, and to trust that He will provide exactly what we need when we need it. God wants us to remember that He is our provider, our sustainer, and our deliverer. In the waiting, we learn to trust in His timing, His wisdom, and His faithfulness. Finally, God's delay in answering our prayers is an invitation to grow in spiritual maturity. As we wait, we are shaped and refined. Our faith grows stronger as we learn to wait patiently, trusting that God is at work even when we don't see immediate results. James 1:4 encourages us, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Spiritual maturity comes through trials, through delays, and through challenges. It is in the waiting that our endurance is developed, and we learn to trust God at a deeper level. The delay is not a sign of God's neglect, but an opportunity for us to grow into the people God has called us to be. In conclusion, when God delays answering our prayers, He is at work in our lives in ways we often can't see. His delays are never arbitrary. They are always purposeful, designed to refine our faith, align our hearts with His will, and prepare us for greater blessings. Though waiting can be hard, we must trust that God's timing is perfect and that He is always working for our good. In the delay, God is doing a deep work in us, maturing our faith, strengthening our trust, and drawing us closer to Him. When the answer finally comes, we will realize that the waiting was not in vain, but a part of God's beautiful and sovereign plan for our lives. Trust in the delay. Trust that God is at work in ways beyond our understanding, and rest in the truth that His timing is always perfect. As we come to the final part of our message, I want to leave you with this crucial truth. God is always at work, even when it feels like He is silent or His answers are delayed. You see, while we may not always understand the why behind God's timing, we can trust that He is orchestrating everything with perfect wisdom and love. If you are in a season of waiting for God to answer your prayer, waiting for breakthrough, or waiting for His guidance, I want to encourage you today. Don't lose heart. Don't let the delay discourage you. Instead, take this opportunity to deepen your faith and trust in God's perfect plan. His delays are not denials. They are divine appointments. Every delay, every moment of waiting is an invitation to grow closer to Him, to trust Him more fully, and to experience His peace in ways you never thought possible. The Bible reminds us in Isaiah 55, 8, 9, that God's ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts higher than our ways, and His thoughts higher than our thoughts. This means that when we don't understand why our prayers are delayed, we can rest assured that God's perspective is far greater than ours. What we see as a delay, God sees as preparation. He is preparing us, shaping us, refining us, and aligning our hearts with His will. His timing is always perfect, and His plan for us is always for our good. Perhaps, like the Israelites in the wilderness, you are waiting on God to fulfill a promise. You may be feeling the weight of disappointment, wondering why He hasn't answered your prayer yet. But know this: God is not absent in your waiting. He is right there with you, and He is working all things together for your good and His glory. Romans 8:28. The example of Jesus' life shows us the importance of waiting for God's timing. Jesus, in His earthly ministry, often delayed His actions for a greater purpose. He didn't rush to perform miracles or rush to answer the prayers of those around Him. When Lazarus was sick, He intentionally delayed going to him, even though He knew that his friend was dying. Why? Because God had a greater plan in mind. Through His delay, Jesus would raise Lazarus from the dead, showing His power over death and revealing His divine identity. God was not being negligent or careless in that delay. He was fulfilling a greater purpose that would bring about more glory and would help deepen the faith of those who were watching. This is how God works in our lives too. When He delays, He's not withholding from us. He's preparing us for something better, something greater, something that will bring Him more glory. As we reflect on the reality of God's timing, we must remember that His delays are not because He is ignoring us. Instead, they are opportunities for us to lean into His presence, to grow in our faith, and to learn the depths of His character. Waiting for God's answers teaches us perseverance, builds our character, and refines our desires. Every moment of waiting is a moment where God is shaping us into the image of His Son. Think of it this way. When we wait, we are in the process of becoming more like Christ. Jesus Himself in His humanity waited on the Father's timing. He didn't rush, He didn't panic, and He didn't take matters into His own hands. He trusted God's plan and timing. And through that, He fulfilled His mission on earth. We are called to do the same. So I want to challenge you today, especially if you are in a season of waiting or frustration with God's timing. Will you trust God in the waiting? Will you surrender your timetable to His, knowing that He is sovereign over every detail of your life? Will you let go of the desire for control and allow Him to work in His perfect timing? It is easy to grow impatient, to feel discouraged, and to question whether God is really at work. But faith is trusting when we can't see the outcome. It's choosing to believe that God is good, that His timing is perfect, and that He is working everything for our good. When we can learn to rest in God's timing, we will find a peace that surpasses all understanding. Philippians 4, 6, 7. We will experience the joy of knowing that we are in His hands and that He is doing something in us that will last for eternity. I want to encourage you to take this moment to reflect on your own heart. Is there an area of your life where you've been waiting on God? Have you grown weary in the waiting? If so, I invite you to come before God in this moment and release your concerns to Him. Surrender your timeline and trust that He is working on your behalf. Ask Him to help you see His purpose in the delay, to give you patience and faith as you wait. Let this be a moment where you choose to trust God's timing, knowing that even in the delay, He is still faithful. Remember, God is never in a hurry. His delays are not signs of His absence, but of His perfect timing. And when He answers, it will be worth the wait. Whether the answer comes in days, months, or even years, God's timing will always be for our good. So let us trust in His wisdom, rest in His perfect timing, and know that the delay is never a denial. It is simply God preparing us for something greater than we could have ever imagined. Let us continue to wait with hope, knowing that our God is faithful, that He hears our prayers, and that in His time He will answer in ways that bring Him glory and us joy. May our hearts be filled with peace as we trust in His perfect plan for our lives.